Hello, coaches, and welcome to this edition of Give and Go Live. My name is David Newberry, and I'm joined by by my colleague Ian Barker. Hello, Ian.
Hello, David, and hello, the coaches.
Ian, we're going to be looking at the second activity in a series of 4 from the 2018 convention featuring Anson, Dorrance, and Damon Nahas. So let's look at the video, and then we'll come back and look at the diagrams.
Okay, so what we have here, now obviously our dimensions change. The space right here affects us in some of the things that we'll do. So we've done it into a bigger space. Depending on what I want to get out of this, I'll use a tighter space if I'm looking for a quicker tempo. But what we have is we designed something to where I'm giving them a direction, but I'm not giving them where I want them to play it. So all of you just back here except for the first one. So right now when that ball is being moved, and normally we will have players that, depending on what age, if they're younger ages, everybody can rotate in here. For these players here, you put in your central players, your forwards, whatever you think are going to be your playmakers, players in positions that they have to be aware in the center of the field. So right now, just say we have our 2 center players in the field. Can I see that ball? So how it'll go, we give them a direction. The ball's in play, and right now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 players in play. Okay? If you're not the next one up, just stand behind the mannequin. So what we ask for our players is for them all to want the ball. We talk about expect the unexpected. So if I am here, what does it look like I'm doing? Where am I going to go? But I need this player here to expect that. And many a times, because we do standard patterns, we lose that creativity. But you have to expect it. The worst thing that happens is I choose to play there. If I play there, your job's to adjust. So right now, I want my far player to expect me to play you the ball. I want Joe's movement to expect the ball. I want your movement to want the ball, and so on and so forth. Whenever the ball travels, we all adjust with it, okay? We are following, once you get it and wherever you pass, you're eventually going to that line. Then the next player comes in. You're going to that line. The 2 here are the only ones that say central. You're going to that line, okay? So just kind of walk through it. So in here, we're always looking for our midfielders. Playing through the lines is an important thing, right? So you visualize that. So compliment her and where you want that ball based on where she's at. So I can look here. I can play Joe. This is no predicament. Here, I look at you. I've chosen to play Joe. Now you can get it behind that line, wherever you want. It's a choice that you get to make. Mandy, I'm on you today. I'm sorry, kiddo. So here, play to Joe. Ultimately, stop, freeze. Exactly. So this is the thing. What I want now when Joe has the ball, what's your name? Kathy? Kathy, I want Kathy to want the ball. Basically, our movement off of the ball is dictating the choices. So in here, Joe has the ball. I just want Kathy to want it. Yeah, ball, she's chosen. Good. Played it. I can get in here. It's our movement after we play is key. And now who's my player over here? Kristen? So, Kristen, I want you to want that ball. So in here, we just established tempo. We did this 1 to 2 times a week. We had to stick with it. Eventually, this became their exercise. And what happened was we saw such a good rhythm, and ultimately the choices and them understanding each other, what each other's likes, how quick you are, you like in your left foot, these things, they learned what each other liked as opposed to me telling them what they needed to do. It's easy for us to watch where the ball is. When they're doing that, I'm watching whether she's paying attention or part of the game. We can't let them fall asleep, whether defending or in the attack. So in here, that person, it has to be all of us accountable. So the next player, you have to be ready for that next ball to come in. It's really, really important. The timing of our run, the flashing off, the quality of our pass is really important. Okay? Here we go. Ready? Play. Just be available for each other. Good. Good. Just put yourself in position to receive the ball. If you don't get it, you make the next best movement. freeze. Okay, ladies, well done. This is the thing as they become, it's not meant to be perfect the first time, right? As they become more and more comfortable with it, they don't become robotic. So what you'll see is this. And coaches, as you watch this, you might have seen this. On the two-touch, they came here. Say she played it there. And then what did this player do? Where did you run, though? What did somebody do? Did they run around? Right? Some of the players ran around. Over here, I saw a player, and this is based on the exercise, where we want to take away the roboticness of it. So in here, a player had the ball, played the ball here, and then ran through this gate. Ultimately, we want them to make the choice based on where they're at. So right now, the game might tell me to play here and then just come get it, right? We just want them to make choices and then ultimately be creative with it. But if the game pulls you in here, don't have to come back in here. Make what you think is the most impactful run based on that situation, okay? Here we go again. Ready? Play. And normally after 2 minutes or so, we would rotate our central players to make sure that they have those reps. Two-touch, oh, you lucky. You're so lucky. That was not a pass to yourself, Joe. I know it. What we want is our timing of our runs, and also, coaches, watch them, because now it's their decisions. And now you can see whether or not some of them are looking. We track this. We actually watch and evaluate who is constantly checking and aware. So now when they're not giving any specific pattern, you can see the players off the ball, whether they're looking or not. We're going to stick to one direction just for time's sake. But in here, important, now it's unlimited. Now you have a choice. The game which the game presents, you have a choice. One touch, two touch, dribble. It's a choice that you have, okay? In here, what we look for is for you to be dominant in your movement, to influence me and or your opponent, and then I have a choice to make. Now it's about whether I have the technical quality to execute, right? Idea is great, execution's poor. These are little things that we want. Can we get a good tempo? In here, you're free, one or two touch. Be available. We just want players that want the ball. We want players to want the ball. And when they don't get it, they're willing to do the work again to get into the next space. Okay, here we go. Let's try it out. Ready? Play. Choices. Should I dribble? Do I one touch? What you'll see is you won't see many players initially dribble because they're going to feel inclined that they should only play one or two touch. What I like to see is whether or not in a moment someone attacks the space. That's exactly expect the unexpected. And really what the exercise does as well is for them to learn how to solve situations. Don't become nervous, and ultimately they're on a stage in front of all of you guys watching them, right? So they don't want to mess up. Good girl. And freeze. Listen, the activity is great, right? I mean, all of you are actively moving. It's really good. The confidence, what we want to do is instill confidence in you to make choices. Good. And when you see them bunched in spaces, let them work it out. Good. Expect it. Good job, ladies. Good job. We're always careful about how often we have them do one touch, because sometimes one touch is a bailout sometimes, right? Because it gets them away from their first touch, right? And sometimes the best reception is taking a touch. We want them to have comfort in tight spaces. So sometimes when players take one touch, you can tell whether or not it's a touch that they're intentioning to do or they just don't want to trap that, or they don't feel comfortable about the space they're around. So that's why it's good to put restrictions sometimes on adding an extra touch. It might be 3 touch so that they're attacking a space. We think it's really, really important because it might seem good in the flow sometimes, but when we get into a 4v2 or a 5v2 or a 3v2, they have to be able to identify space and trap under pressure. It's really important.
So yeah, now let's have a look at some of those diagrams that relate to that video we've just seen. And the setup is a little bit more complex than the first activity we looked at, which was a very simple 4-player passing pattern. This one, as I say, a bit more complex. So let's have a look at some of the positioning of players and equipment. First of all, the ball starts at one end of the rectangle, and there are players situating on each side and at the other end. Those players are there for support. The player in the middle, and Damon refers to that as the central midfield player, the number 6 and number 8. That player is constantly involved in the pattern. And the objective is to allow players to determine the passing patterns as they move around the area in one direction, and then eventually work around the same area in the other direction. And the last thing I'd like to mention before I hand over to Ian is the movement of players. So this player who starts with possession will play into the middleman. The player plays out. And then once the ball is transferred to the side, the player that initiated the movement moves around, and that movement of players continues until the coach stops the activity and then changes the player in the middle. So Ian, let's talk about some of the methods we might see with this first sequence.
Well, obviously, the session develops for Damon and gets more players involved. But definitely, from my perspective, the focus is this player, this central midfielder. And if I've got a functional training session, I'm not going to put all the players into that rotation, but my key central players, my 6, my 8, my 10, maybe my number 9 as well. But I'm not going to put all the players in there. To begin with, it makes a lot of sense to me when you use these types of training sessions to give the players 1 or 2 patterns. So in, back, forward. That's a perfectly reasonable pattern. And I might encourage the players to use that. And then when the blue player checks the other side, it comes in, it comes back, and we play down the other flank. So I like to have a couple of patterns established. So another example of a pattern could be 1 is high, the player moves off the ball, they get it back, and they go in. So it's still 3 players in the movement, but we've given a different kind of pattern. And then after a while, as we bleed in live defenders or live opponents, the players are now challenged to pick the best pattern for themselves. So all through the session, the coach was talking about empowering the players to make choices, to make choices, to make choices. Until you've given them, though, a range of options, it's hard for them to make the choice. So absolutely establish your patterns. I love the use of the mannequins. Not all club coaches have them, but they're really nice for players to actually have to make a bigger physical movement to get open. So obviously, the mannequins aren't going to move to intercept, but it does make significant challenge to your passing to make that right. And then it also gets better movement. So I really like these types of activities. They've got a nice flow, lots of technical aspects, and legitimate movement and passing patterns.
Now, Ian, we have now offered many different types of activities along these same rules and regulations with conditions, somewhat simplistic, but then also having the ability for the coach to increase the challenge. And in this activity, Damon had referred to breaking the lines. So if we observe the player on the sideline, we see the player breaking the lines. Would you just talk a little bit about that particular nuance when it comes to methodology?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think breaking the lines is a fairly oft used term nowadays, but sometimes we as coaches not quite sure. So I might look at this as the line. So let's say that blue line represents the opposing midfield line, or it could even be the centre backs. So essentially the offside line, right? But that's the line. Now the trick is not necessarily for us to play into our player and then he or she has to turn and try to break the line. The idea is to get the ball beyond lines into these spaces in front and behind lines. And ultimately, I'll triple the arrow up here, break the line and get into that space. So the movement of the blue player 2 will obviously impact the defenders. The diagonal movement of the original passer off here now creates an angle, which allows a penetrating pass to a movement which is indeed breaking the line. So you're encouraging your players to look to move into spaces behind opponents and also to play the ball into spaces in behind opponents and thereby achieving the aim of breaking the lines.
So on our second sequence, we now see the continuation of the movement. The player that receives the ball wide then plays, instead of back into the middle, decides to then play to the player in a higher position. And if you recall in the video, Damon had repeatedly referred to the decision being that of the player on the ball. So it's not a prescribed movement. We played forward, we played high, and then that player, maybe it's the number 9 central forward, has played back into the central midfield player. And similarly, the player that received the ball at the end, the higher player, has now moved to collect a second pass. And so the central midfield player and the striker has now combined again, and that has offered the opportunity for the striker to bring in another wide player. Ian.
Yeah, so timing can become very critical if we make this an offside line, right? So if we use that last defender as offside, that can certainly be the case. So that ticks this box. Definitely like the idea that we can go up and then just come back the other way, because for the central player, that shouldn't be an undue challenge because he or she plays in that 365-degree area. And then these players on the flank, sometimes the implication is a left-footed going forward or right-footed going forward. So I quite like that from a youth technical standpoint for sure. And then for me, of this diagram, and I think, we focus on the passes and see how many players we've got involved in those diagonals or W's or whatever we've created. But this comes out in Damon's session is this player is very important. This player here at the top of the screen with the movement arrow. Because what he's saying is, as stuff is happening in here pretty tight around the ball, what are you now doing to be involved in the play as opposed to just standing? Now, obviously, if they just stand, then they're going to bring defenders in and they're going to bring traffic in. If they just run down the field, they'll run into offside positions and not really be connected. So maybe that movement is just to check back in a step to then create space to move behind or move across or move into attacking positions. But what's clear in the session as you watch it on the video is that all of the players are being encouraged to move into potentially useful spaces, including if this white player drifts in, then the blue player has to now find a new space because you don't want two of your teammates or two of your players occupying the same space. So I think there's some really interesting implications for complementary movement here.
As we move into our third sequence, a couple of nuances here that have changed. One is now that the coach has lifted the restrictions on the number of touches. So before it was 1 and 2 touch, now the number of touches are unlimited, and now we're no longer just going around in a clockwise or anti-clockwise direction. The players are encouraged now to improvise and to now find players on either side and either end as they see fit. So now we see a much more fluent movement. We see a lot of improvisation. We see some dribbling. So Ian, I think now this activity has really taken on a life of its own and now is much more game realistic.
Yeah, what I like about it is, though, that we start with the balls at this end, right? So if we start with all the balls at this end, we are essentially suggesting to the players that ultimately we want to get to this end. I personally like that because I think that does give us that strong sense of a single direction. So now this player is a number 6. They're checking back to get the ball. And then they're ultimately trying to get the ball upfield and we go forward. So I like that. However, you could start with balls at all 4 stations and take it in turns to deliver a ball in And so now it's really a 360-degree game, and you're just working the movement and decision-making of your central midfielders, and then you're working on the support aspect of the players around the edge and then stepping in and joining in. So again, lots of opportunities with this session to develop what it is you want to focus on. So you can make this a purely technical session, first, second touch. And Damon made a good point about sometimes first touch is just a panic. It's not really a genuine first touch. So we could be working on technical ability. We could be working on the weight of passes. We could be working on the sharpness of movement and the communication, visual, verbal and nonverbal. And we certainly want to be working on the tactics of passing and supporting in tactical ways to get forward. So the principles of play for attacking certainly become very viable coaching content within a session like this.
Just before we go in, worth mentioning a couple of the manuals that we have available on topics such as this topic of changing the tempo, attacking tempo. We have a manual that's talking about the technical aspects of the game. In fact, we have two, 60 technical training activities and the technical soccer coaching manual. Your final thoughts?
Yeah, well, I'm really glad to be able to do webinars like this because we have the video, which for some learners is great. That's what they want to see. Then we have the narration and the ideas from David and myself, which is another way of learning. And one of the ways that I think still remains very popular with most coaches, including myself, is occasionally just to be able to sit down and reflect quietly with some diagrams and some notes. So these manuals, I've contributed my content in there. I know David has, and a number of top coaches. So these become alternative learning tools or supplemental learning tools to video and to interaction, narration, PowerPoint, annotation on the screen. So if you're in that type of learning mentality, maybe you're a little bit zoomed out, I highly recommend these books because I'm very proud to have contributed to them myself.
Well, thank you, Ian, and thank you, coaches, for joining us. And we will see you on the next edition of Give and Go Live.